It has been one of the biggest mysteries raging across the internet. Who is Satoshi Nakamoto? Newsweek published an article claiming the man in these images is the Bitcoin founder. The man who created Bitcoin is known as the father of Bitcoin, the online currency now worth billions.
When you asked him about Bitcoin and he says, I can't talk about this anymore, he was not referring to Bitcoin.
But with me, he definitely acknowledged Bitcoin. I think at this point now he's saying he was confused about the conversation. Clearly somebody thought that we did this as an act of war against Satoshi Nakamoto or Bitcoin, and I want to be very clear that I certainly never meant it that way.
I have nothing to do with Bitcoin.
It was a monstrous story. How did they figure it out? Oh my God, look at this guy that they named. His name is Dorian Satoshi Nakamoto, living in California, basically hiding in plain sight. It becomes a gigantic media scramble. And then Dorian emerges from his house looking kind of disheveled, looking kind of confused, and says he's not Satoshi Nakamoto, says he's never heard of Bitcoin. He doesn't understand. He had one conversation with Leah. She misunderstood what he said. She took it the wrong way. And you probably would have had to have been a cypherpunk to understand all the elements of it that had already been put together. The odds of it seem very low to me that it was somebody from completely outside that community who happened to know all these different things and put this together and appear out of nowhere.
The day that Newsweek's story came out, naming Dorian Nakamoto as the creator of Bitcoin, I got this email from an old acquaintance that was titled, "What are the odds?" And it's laid out the fact that Hal Finney lives less than 2 miles away from the known address of Dorian Nakamoto, where Newsweek had found him. And Hal Finney is the #2 ever user of Bitcoin, who received the first Bitcoin transaction. He worked on an early prototype of an anonymous currency system. He was a cypherpunk. So how could it be that the purported creator of Bitcoin and this known, confirmed, second ever user of Bitcoin hadn't ever collaborated, that Hal Finney, who was less than 2 miles away from Dorian Nakamoto, hadn't helped to create Bitcoin? Or maybe he really was the creator of Bitcoin. Maybe Hal Finney was Satoshi Nakamoto.
When you look at the Bitcoin white paper, it made reference to a lot of the earlier projects that fed into Bitcoin, but it's very notable that the one project it doesn't refer to is Nick Szabo's BitGold, which is perhaps the closest precedent and the closest parallel to Bitcoin.
I mean, BitGold is so close to Bitcoin, it's hard not to think that, maybe Nick is Satoshi.
A lot of people will say Nakamoto must be Szabo, Nakamoto must have been Finney. But I don't think he was trying to leave any breadcrumbs out there for anybody to follow.
I told my editor about it. He agreed that you found Satoshi Nakamoto. So I got on a plane to Santa Barbara and I drove out to Hal Finney's house. But at this stage, he was already completely paralyzed by ALS. This really awful, debilitating terminal illness that slowly shuts down your body while leaving your mind completely intact. And the time when he started to fade in his physical abilities did roughly coincide with the time that Satoshi Nakamoto started to disappear. Maybe the reason that Satoshi Nakamoto had chosen to fade away was because Hal Finney was physically fading.
There have been a number of stylometric studies, and you see so many of these similarities between Satoshi's writing and those of Nick's, including these little things like having 2 spaces at the beginning of a sentence and phrases and spellings that nobody else uses.
So I talked to Hal as much as I could, mostly in a kind of one-way interview, because he could really only respond with yes and no answers. And he denied being Satoshi Nakamoto. You could tell that he was amused by the whole idea that I thought he was Satoshi Nakamoto.
One of the really remarkable things from Nick Szabo's writing in those months before Bitcoin was publicly launched is that Nick, in responding to some comments about a post he had made about BitGold, actually asked the other people who were reading him if anybody wanted to help him code this idea up into real software that could work. It was never turned into a reality, but when you look at BitGold, it's hard not to be struck by the similarities between it and Bitcoin.
Maybe it was a duo. It was Szabo and Hal Finney, and now
it's possible. Yeah, Hal could have been the coder. I don't know.
You know, this idea that Hal Finney could have been the kind of ghost coder for Bitcoin, I guess it's possible. Other people kind of speculating on Reddit or other parts of the internet thought that maybe Hal Finney had used Dorian Nakamoto as a patsy. If he were ever traced back to Dorian Nakamoto, it would seem like this guy was the creator and Hal Finney would be sort of immunized from it.
Everyone else who was involved in the projects leading up to Bitcoin has released their communications with Satoshi from this period. Nick has avoided doing that and essentially went silent in those critical months after Bitcoin was released.
You know, when you talk to people face to face and they tell you these things, you can get a sense if they're being honest. And if Hal Finney actually had a secret billion-dollar cache of Bitcoins, he wouldn't have been able to lie to me so effectively about it. In the end, the reasons to believe that this was all just a coincidence began to outweigh the coincidence itself.
It's almost like an eel. There's something there, you can see it, but as soon as you touch it, it just slides right out of your hands and you're left with nothing. Anybody who is of any note in the cypherpunk movement, and even outside of it too, has at one time or another been called Satoshi. Hal Finney denied it, Nick Szabo denied it, they've all denied it. Maybe one of them is Satoshi, maybe all of them are Satoshi. It really is a mystery.